Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Doris F. had lived in Benin City for most of her 35 years, her days stitched together like the seams of the dresses she made in her small tailoring shop at Upper Mission Extension. Every morning, she would push open the rusty shutters and watch the street wake, hawkers balancing trays of bread, taxi drivers shouting for passengers, and school children in rumpled uniforms dragging their bags. The air was often heavy with the smell of fried plantain and exhaust fumes, a mixture that somehow became part of her daily rhythm. Doris was known for her quiet confidence, the woman who smiled through her loneliness and told everyone that life had its own timing. But inside, she sometimes felt like a clock that had stopped ticking. The women around her were getting married, posting pictures of anniversaries and babies, while her evenings were filled with the hum of her sewing machine and the occasional radio host promising that true love can still find you, no matter your age. She laughed at such promises, though secretly she longed to believe them. There were nights she would sit by her window watching the orange glow of city lights, wondering what kind of heartache or miracle could still be waiting for her in a city where dreams often got lost in traffic. One humid Thursday afternoon, as the sun fought through the Harmattan haze, Michael Dunladi walked into her shop carrying a torn suit. He was tall, with a kind of presence that filled the small space even before he spoke. His accent carried traces of the North, smooth, deliberate, like someone who weighed every word before letting it go. Doris noticed the gold band on his finger, but told herself it wasn't her business. As she examined the suit, he made small talk about Benin's unpredictable weather and how the city's traffic was worse than Abuja's. She chuckled, threading her needle with practiced precision, and replied that at least in Benin, people still greeted strangers with warmth. There was a lightness in their exchange that felt new, like the beginning of something neither of them had planned. When he returned a few days later to pick up the suit, he lingered longer than necessary, complimenting her craftsmanship, then asked if she knew a good place to eat pounded yam. Doris recommended a small restaurant near Ring Road, and to her surprise, he offered to take her there. She almost refused, but something in his tone, gentle yet insistent, made her say yes. That first meal stretched into hours of conversation, laughter, and a strange sense of familiarity that felt almost dangerous. By the time he dropped her home, the city lights had softened into evening gold, and Doris could feel something in her heart stirring, something she hadn't felt in years. In the weeks that followed, Michael became a steady rhythm in her life, showing up at her shop with food, calling her in the evenings just to hear her voice. He spoke about his business in construction, his travels between Kano and Abuja, and how lonely success could be when your heart was empty. Doris didn't ask about his wife, she didn't need to. He painted a picture of a marriage that had lost its color, a house filled with silence and children he rarely saw because their mother kept them away. It was the kind of story that tugged at Doris's compassion, that made her feel like she was offering him a kind of healing no one else could give. They began to meet more often, sometimes under the guise of business errands, sometimes simply to sit in his car parked near the old museum ground while the city moved around them. Michael spoke like a man who had seen too much, and Doris listened like a woman who had waited too long. Their connection grew quietly, like a secret flame behind closed curtains. People began to notice her brighter dresses, the new scent she wore, the sudden laughter that spilled from her shop. Even her landlady teased, "Madam Doris, you day shine these days, oh. Love don't catch you." Doris would smile and say nothing. Yet, deep down, she feared what she was becoming, a woman chasing warmth and borrowed fire. The affair deepened like dusk falling over the city, slowly, beautifully, but with an edge of darkness. Michael began visiting her at night, their whispered conversations blending with the hum of ceiling fans and distant car horns. He told her about his dreams of moving to Abuja permanently, of leaving behind a marriage built on duty rather than love. Doris wanted to believe him, even when the truth flickered like a faulty bulb. There were nights when guilt crept in, when she remembered the wife whose name she'd never asked, or the children whose faces she'd never seen. But when Michael held her and called her my peace, all the questions dissolved. She started imagining a future with him, a small flat in Woz, a shared life where nobody judged them. Her friends warned her quietly, reminding her that love borrowed from another woman's home rarely brings peace. But Doris brushed them off with a tired smile. She told herself love was not about right or wrong. It was about timing, and perhaps her time had finally come. Still, sometimes at night, when he left her to return to wherever he called home, she'd sit on her bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, whispering to herself that happiness shouldn't feel this heavy. The city outside roared on, indifferent, as she drifted into sleep, clutching the phone that never rang first. When Michael suggested they should move to Abuja, Doris thought he was joking. The idea sounded far-fetched at first, like one of those promises lovers make in the heat of a soft night, but never keep. Yet Michael was serious. He spoke of the capital city like a sanctuary, a place where they could breathe freely without the weight of judgment. Benin is too small, he had said one evening as they sat in his car watching the rain paint silver streaks on the windshield. Every corner here has eyes. Abuja will give us space to start afresh. Doris didn't answer at once. She traced the outline of her palm and thought about how change could feel both exciting and terrifying. She had never lived anywhere outside Benin, and the thought of packing her life into boxes for a man still technically married should have been reason enough to pause. But the heart, when it decides to leap, doesn't ask logic for permission. A month later, she sold some of her sewing machines, packed her clothes, and boarded a night bus to Abuja with Michael. The hum of the road lulled her into a fragile hope. As dawn broke, the city stretched before them, wide roads, glittering streetlights, and the distant promise of anonymity. Doris felt as if she was being reborn into a world where love could finally breathe. Their new flat in Gwarimpa was modest, 2 rooms with pale walls and the faint smell of paint, but to Doris it was a castle. That first morning, she stood by the window watching the city wake, the air thick with ambition, horns blaring, and vendors shouting. It was a new rhythm, one she was ready to dance to. She told herself that every love story deserves a clean slate, even one that begins with borrowed hearts. Their days in Abuja unfolded with a rhythm that felt like music. Doris cooked in the evenings while Michael returned from work with that same easy charm that first drew her in. He brought her suya wrapped in paper, sometimes small trinkets from his market, and always that lingering scent of aftershave and exhaustion. At night, they would sit by the small balcony, watching headlights weave through the dark like restless fireflies. Doris began to memorize his laughter, the tilt of his head when he listened, the way he brushed her cheek absent-mindedly while talking about his projects. It felt like life had finally opened its hands to her. When she wasn't with him, she explored the city, Jabi Lake on quiet afternoons, the dusty stalls of Utako, the chatter of women at Garki Market. Abuja was different from Benin. It was faster, colder, yet strangely full of hope. She liked the anonymity it offered, the sense that she and Michael could exist outside of anyone's story but their own. Still, beneath the comfort of their new life, an unease began to grow like a quiet shadow. Sometimes his phone would ring late at night, and he would step outside to answer it. Other times, she'd find him staring out the window, lost in thought. When she asked, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just business calls." Doris wanted to believe him. She told herself love required trust, even when it came wrapped in doubt. But the silence that followed those calls began to stretch like elastic, pulling at the edges of her peace. Months turned into a soft blur of laughter, errands, and promises. Michael often told her, "You're the calm I never had," and she would blush like a girl hearing such words for the first time. They started dreaming aloud, about buying land in Lugby, about opening a small boutique where Doris could design, and so while Michael handled contracts. It sounded beautiful, almost too perfect to question. One Sunday morning, as the golden sun washed over the city, Doris watched him from the kitchen doorway, bare-chested, reading a newspaper, looking every bit the man she believed fate had sent to her late but right on time. She walked up, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered, "Promise me you'll never leave." He looked up slowly, his eyes unreadable for a moment, then smiled. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, kissing her forehead. She wanted to hold on to that promise like a talisman. Yet that same night, she woke to find him sitting in the dark, phone in hand, the glow reflecting worry across his face. He quickly smiled and said it was nothing, but something in his tone made her heart skip. Love, she realized, could be sweet and heavy at the same time, like honey laced with salt. Still, she pushed the thought aside, convincing herself that every love story has its storms, and theirs was just passing through one. By the 4th month, Doris found herself adjusting to Abuja's pulse, but her body began to change in ways she couldn't ignore. Morning sickness, cravings, and an unfamiliar tiredness settled in. At first, she thought it was stress, until the test strip told her the truth. She was pregnant. She sat on the bathroom floor, one hand on her stomach, the other clutching the test, tears slipping down her face. Not tears of fear, but disbelief that life was finally offering her a new beginning. When Michael came home that evening, she greeted him with trembling hands and whispered, "I'm pregnant." For a moment his eyes widened, then softened. He pulled her close and said, "This is our sign. Everything's going to be different now." Doris laughed through her tears, imagining baby names, tiny clothes, and family introductions. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness. She began decorating the spare room, humming to herself as she worked. Michael promised to visit her family in Benin soon. He even talked about buying a car so she could be more comfortable. For the first time, Doris allowed herself to believe she had found her forever. Yet, in the quiet hours of night, when she lay awake listening to the faint hum of Abuja's distant traffic, she sometimes felt a strange fear curling inside her. A whisper that said some fires burn too bright to last, and some promises, no matter how sweetly spoken, are only meant for a season. Doris woke before dawn one Saturday to the sound of rain tapping the window pane like soft fingers asking for entry. The morning felt different, quiet in a way that made her heart uneasy. Michael had left early for a supposed meeting at a construction site in Lugby, and though she trusted his words, something in his tone had carried an edge she couldn't name. She pressed a hand to her growing belly and whispered a short prayer under her breath. Each day, the small life inside her made her feel more anchored, more hopeful, as if all the wrong turns of her past had led her to this one blessing. She had started writing in a small diary, lists of baby names, sketches of what the nursery could look like, and her secret dreams about a wedding that might one day follow. Her days were filled with preparations, and even when Michael came home too tired to talk, she chose to see the love still flickering behind his weariness. Sometimes they took evening walks down their street in Guarimpa, talking about the future, their hands brushing against each other's. But lately Michael's phone seemed to ring more often, and each time he stepped outside to answer it, Doris would feel the familiar pinch of unease tightening around her chest. When she asked, he would say, "Business doesn't wait, sweetheart. I'm doing all this for us." She wanted to believe him. Love, she thought, was not about perfection but persistence. Still, deep down, a small, frightened voice whispered that something was changing, that the same city that had given her love might soon take it back. The weeks that followed were a mixture of calm and confusion. Doris threw herself into small joys, shopping for baby clothes at his market, cooking Michael's favorite meals, and singing softly to her stomach when she was alone. She found herself watching couples at the park and imagining how she and Michael would take strolls with their child, how laughter would echo through their home. But happiness is a fragile guest, and sometimes it leaves without warning. It began with Michael spending more nights away, claiming late contracts and unexpected trips. He would come home smelling faintly of alcohol, his shirt crumpled, eyes red from sleeplessness. When Doris confronted him gently, he smiled and said, "You worry too much. I told you, everything I do now is for us." The words soothed her for a while, but her instincts remained restless. The day she saw his wedding ring back on his finger, her heart nearly stopped. He noticed her stare and quickly hid his hand behind his back, mumbling that he had worn it out of habit. Doris wanted to shout, to demand the truth, but fear of losing him tied her tongue. Instead, she nodded and forced a smile. That night she couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan hummed above her like a distant warning, and tears soaked her pillow as she held her belly close. "Don't worry," she whispered to her unborn child. "Mummy's here. Everything will be fine." But her voice trembled, and in the darkness, even her reflection on the window seemed to look back with pity. By May, the air in Abuja grew thick with heat, and Doris moved slower, her body heavy with the weight of impending motherhood. One humid morning, while preparing to bathe, her world changed in an instant. The bathroom tiles were slick from water, and as she reached for her towel, her foot slipped. The sound of her fall echoed like thunder, followed by a sharp cry that tore through the quiet house. The next thing she remembered was the hospital's bright lights and the smell of antiseptic. Michael sat beside her bed, his face pale, eyes swollen from lack of sleep. The doctor's voice came like a blade through the fog. She had lost the baby. Doris stared blankly, her mind refusing to catch up with her body. She turned her face to the wall and wept until her throat burned. Michael held her hand, murmuring soft apologies, but his words felt hollow, like echoes in a cave. When they returned home, the apartment felt emptier than ever, every sound a reminder of what was gone. The baby clothes she had folded neatly on the chair now looked like small ghosts waiting for someone who would never come. Days passed in silence. She barely ate, barely spoke. Her world had tilted, and no amount of comfort could steady it. Sometimes, when Michael tried to console her, she would flinch at his touch, not from anger but from the knowledge that their love, too, might have slipped and shattered without her noticing. Weeks melted into each other, and grief became her new routine. Michael tried to resume normal life, leaving early, returning late, pretending that time could sweep away sorrow like dust from a shelf. But Doris could see the cracks spreading wider between them. One evening after dinner, he received another call and stepped outside. She followed quietly, standing behind the curtain, and heard his voice soften in a way she hadn't heard in months. He wasn't talking to a colleague. The words, "I miss you too, she's recovering," stabbed her like knives. When he returned, she pretended she had heard nothing. There was no strength left in her for confrontation. She merely smiled faintly and said she was tired. That night, she packed some clothes into a small bag, just in case her heart demanded escape. But the morning came, and she stayed. Love, no matter how broken, has a cruel way of holding people captive. The days grew quieter after that. Michael still lived in the same house, but it felt like they now inhabited two separate worlds under one roof. Doris began to wonder if healing meant learning how to live with emptiness, or if it meant letting go entirely. She didn't know yet, but she could feel something in her shifting, a slow, painful awakening that love, even when wrapped in tenderness, can still leave scars deep enough to echo forever. The morning air in Guarimpa felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were tired of holding back words left unsaid. Doris sat by the window, staring at the half-empty cup of tea that had gone cold. Michael had left early again, claiming to have a client meeting in Maitama, but she no longer bothered to ask when he would return. The once familiar rhythm of their life had crumbled like dry bread, and silence now filled the spaces where laughter used to live. The ache in her chest had dulled over time, no longer sharp but steady, like a wound that refused to heal. She wandered through the house, touching things without purpose, the picture frame on the table, the folded baby clothes she hadn't had the courage to throw away, the curtains that still smelled faintly of his cologne. When she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Her face had grown leaner, her eyes quieter. The sparkle that used to draw Michael's admiration had dimmed, replaced by something harder, something that understood too well that promises could rot like fruit left too long in the sun. She began spending more time on the balcony, watching the neighborhood come alive while she sat motionless, her thoughts chasing themselves in circles. The world outside carried on, indifferent to her grief. She often wondered if heartbreak had a sound. Maybe it was the faint creak of a door closing, or the whisper of a phone that no longer rang. Each day bled into the next, and in that sameness, she felt herself fading, piece by piece. It was Samuel who showed up unannounced one Wednesday afternoon, knocking on the door with the kind of urgency only family carries. Doris opened it, and froze at the sight of her younger brother, standing there with worry written across his face. He was the one person she hadn't wanted to see, because Samuel had always been her mirror to the truth. "Sister, what's happening?" "Michael called me," he said as he stepped inside. Doris blinked, confusion cutting through her fatigue. "Michael called you?" she asked. "Why?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "He said you're not okay." He sounded different. "I thought it was best to come." That night, as they sat on the couch, Samuel tried to coax the truth out of her, but Doris only managed fragments, grief, loss, and the sound of doors closing behind her. Samuel stayed for days, doing small things like fixing the leaking tap or buying groceries, trying to make her eat. His presence brought a kind of quiet order to the chaos, but it also highlighted how much had changed. One evening Michael called. Doris froze, her heart caught between longing and rage. She answered, her voice barely steady. "Michael?" There was a pause before his voice came, low and final. "Doris, please don't call me again. I've gone back to my wife. Let's end this before we destroy each other." For a moment, she thought she had misheard. The words replayed in her mind like an echo that refused to die. By the time she dropped the phone, her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor. Samuel rushed to her side, but she waved him off, her face blank, her eyes dry. The tears didn't come until later that night, when she lay in bed, and the darkness offered her no mercy. The following weeks passed like scenes from a film she no longer wanted to watch. Samuel stayed until her rent expired, insisting she come home with him to Benin. Doris resisted at first, clinging to the illusion that Michael might return, that there might still be something left to salvage. But reality is a stubborn teacher, and when the landlord finally came knocking, she knew the time had come to let go. She packed her few belongings, clothes, sewing tools, and the small diary that held her dreams of motherhood, and followed her brother out of the city that had once promised her new beginnings. The journey back felt longer than before, each mile dragging behind it a memory she wished she could bury. When the bus rolled into Benin, the familiar chaos of the city felt foreign, almost mocking. Mama F was waiting at the door, arms folded, eyes sharp as knives. "So this is what love gave you," she said without greeting. Her voice carried the weight of disappointment and heartbreak only a mother could wield. Doris stood silently, her bag still in her hand, unable to look her mother in the eye. "You left home chasing another woman's husband," Mama F continued, "and now you return empty-handed. You see why elders say, when you dance with fire, don't complain about the burns." Samuel tried to speak, but Doris stopped him with a quiet shake of her head. There was nothing left to defend. The words struck her like stones, each one landing with painful precision. That night, she lay on her old bed, staring at the ceiling that hadn't changed, listening to the crickets outside, and realizing how far she had fallen from the woman she once was. Life in Benin moved at its own pace, unhurried and unbothered by her sorrow. The days melted together, sunrise, chores, silence, sleep. Doris tried to help her mother at the small provisions stall near the main road, but gossip traveled faster than wind. Old neighbors whispered, eyes following her every move. Some pitied her, others smirked, saying she got what she deserved. Each whisper stung, but she endured it quietly. She no longer had the energy to defend herself. In the evenings, she sat under the old mango tree behind the house, watching the sky bleed into orange and purple. The city's noise faded at that hour, replaced by the distant hum of generators and the soft rustle of leaves. Sometimes Samuel joined her, and they talked about small things, his work, their cousins, the price of food. But most times she sat alone, lost in thought. She often wondered what Michael was doing, whether his wife had truly taken him back, or if he lay awake at night thinking of her. The ache had softened, but it remained, a quiet pulse under her ribs. Each passing day, she felt herself learning the art of endurance, how to live with pain without letting it consume her, how to smile even when her heart felt hollow. Her mother still scolded her occasionally, her words sharp but born of love. And though Doris never said it aloud, she understood now that heartbreak wasn't just losing someone. It was losing the version of yourself that believed love could fix everything. The city's air was heavy with heat and dust, but in that weight, she began to find a strange peace, the kind that comes when you stop fighting what cannot be undone. The Harmattan season arrived quietly that year, spreading its dusty fingers across Benin City like a restless spirit. The mornings were cold, the afternoons unbearably dry, and the evenings felt heavy with unshed tears. Doris had grown accustomed to the rhythm of village life again, fetching water, helping her mother at the stall, pretending that the world beyond their compound no longer existed. But even in her silence, memories of Abuja lingered like perfume that refused to fade. Every so often, she caught herself humming songs she used to play while cooking for Michael, and the sound would stop her heart for a second before she forced herself back into the present. The laughter that used to bubble from her chest now came sparingly, brittle around the edges. Samuel often tried to lighten her mood, bringing small gifts from town, new slippers, a bright scarf, roasted corn wrapped in newspaper, but even he knew that her smile no longer reached her eyes. At night, she would lie awake listening to the distant rumble of generators and the occasional cry of an owl, wondering what Michael was doing, whether he remembered the woman who once believed he would change his world for her. Sometimes she dreamt of him, his hands, his voice, the way he once said her name as if it was sacred. She would wake from those dreams with her pillow wet, her chest aching with a longing she tried to kill every morning. The days dragged, one bleeding into another, but somewhere beneath the ashes of her sorrow, something stubborn remained alive, some faint pulse that refused to die, though she didn't yet know whether it was hope or simply the echo of habit. The gossip around town eventually began to quiet, replaced by the next scandal in the neighborhood, but the scars it left on Doris were slower to fade. Every time she passed a group of women laughing near the market, she felt their whispers brushing against her skin like invisible needles. She learned to walk through it with her chin lifted, though her heart carried its bruises in silence. Mama F remained harsh, but her words softened slightly after falling ill for several days. Doris took care of her, cooking and cleaning without complaint, and perhaps it was that quiet service that made her mother begin to see her not as a failure, but as a wounded soul trying to piece herself back together. One Sunday, while they sat outside peeling groundnuts, Mama F said, "Life no be straight road, my daughter. Sometimes even goat way get rope for neck go still eat leaf for bush." It was her way of saying forgiveness had come, even if she would never admit it directly. Doris smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had seen too much and learned that words could heal as much as they could wound. That night, she looked up at the sky and whispered her own kind of prayer, not for Michael to return, but for her heart to finally forget. Still, forgetting was a stubborn process. Every man who tried to speak to her after church met a polite but distant version of her. She had built walls too tall for ordinary affection to climb. Yet sometimes, when she walked through the busy streets and saw couples laughing together, she felt a pang so sharp it took her breath away. It wasn't jealousy. It was mourning for the woman she used to be before love became a battlefield. Her spirit had changed. She now understood that the heart, once cracked, never beats quite the same again. One evening, Samuel returned from town with news that struck like a clap of thunder. Michael had been in an accident on the Abuja-Lokoja Expressway. He survived but was badly injured, and his wife had finally left him, taking the children. Doris sat quietly, her fingers tightening around the cup in her hand. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Samuel watched her carefully, unsure of whether to continue. "I thought you'd want to know," he said softly. She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "So the storm found him too." That night, she couldn't sleep. Images of Michael flooded her mind, his laughter, his hands, his promises. The news stirred something she thought she had buried long ago, not love exactly, but the ghost of it. She wondered if he was lying in a hospital bed somewhere, calling her name, realizing too late that he had traded something real for something fleeting. The next morning, she woke before dawn and sat outside watching the sky lighten. Her heart felt like a battlefield of old emotions, pity, anger, tenderness, all fighting for space. When Samuel asked if she wanted to send a message to him, she shook her head. What would I even say? That I still remember? That I no longer hate him? That's his own cross to carry. Yet even as she said it, she knew that somewhere deep inside her, compassion still lingered. Not the kind that begged for reconciliation, but the kind that mourned what could have been if love had not been so selfish, so careless, so cruel. 2 weeks later, while she was sweeping the front yard, a familiar voice called her name from the gate. She froze. When she turned, Michael stood there, thinner, paler, leaning on a walking stick. Time had humbled him. The confidence that once filled his every step was gone. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, neither speaking. Finally, he said, "Doris, I've lost everything." His voice cracked, and she saw the man behind the arrogance, the brokenness she had once prayed he would feel, not out of spite, but so he would understand what he had done to her. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Please forgive me." Doris stood still, her broom hanging limply by her side. She could have shouted, wept, or turned away, but instead she spoke softly. "You didn't lose everything, Michael. You gave it away, piece by piece." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured. "You thought wrong," she said simply. The silence that followed was thick, but it was not bitter. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of what used to be love, finally understanding that not every wound is meant to be reopened. As he walked away, the air felt lighter. Doris watched until he disappeared down the road, the past finally retreating with him. When she turned back toward the house, the evening sun bathed her face in soft gold. For the first time in years, her heart felt still. She whispered under her breath, "The fire burned out, but at least I survived the smoke." And with that, she swept the last of the dust from her doorway, ready to let life begin again. The weeks after Michael's visit unfolded like the slow fading of an old song, its echoes still lingering long after the music had stopped. The first few mornings, Doris found herself expecting to see him again, perhaps standing at the gate, perhaps returning with another apology. But he never did. Instead, life resumed its unhurried pace. The harmattan wind softened, and the trees around the compound began to bloom again, their leaves bright against the pale sky. She spent her days quietly, finding comfort in small routines, sweeping the yard before sunrise, helping her mother sort tomatoes at the stall, and sitting by the window during the cool evenings with a cup of zobo in hand. Each passing day felt like a quiet lesson in forgiveness, not for Michael, but for herself. There were moments when memories came uninvited, the feel of his laughter brushing against her skin, the warmth of his hand in hers, the fragile joy of believing in a future that never came. But instead of bitterness, she felt something gentler, acceptance. Time, she realized, doesn't erase pain. It teaches you how to hold it differently. She no longer flinched at the mention of his name, no longer replayed the what-ifs. Abuja had become a faraway chapter in her story, a city that had taught her both love's sweetness and its cruelty. When Samuel teased her one afternoon about smiling for no reason, she only said, "Peace no day shout, it just stays quiet and full." Her brother laughed, not knowing how much weight those words carried. As months passed, Doris began sewing again, though not for survival this time but for solace. The sound of the needle cutting through fabric became her new form of prayer. Neighbors started bringing their clothes again, and soon her mother's front yard was filled with folded garments and quiet chatter. People no longer whispered her story like scandal. They spoke her name with a kind of cautious respect, as if she had survived something sacred. One evening, a woman came to her with a torn wedding dress, saying it was the only thing left after her husband abandoned her. Doris listened without judgment, repaired the dress with careful hands, and charged nothing for the work. As she handed it back, she said softly, "Not everything broken is meant to be thrown away. Sometimes mending is enough." That became her silent creed. She started helping women in the community learn small tailoring skills, not as a business, but as therapy for hearts that had been bruised by life. Word spread quietly. People began calling her Auntie Doris, the strong one. But she never saw herself that way. In her mind, she was just a woman who had walked through fire and learned how to breathe again. Some nights, she would sit outside after everyone had gone to bed, tracing constellations across the sky and thinking about how every star carried its own burn marks but still managed to shine. The past no longer haunted her. It had simply become part of her rhythm, like a faint melody she could hum without pain. One late afternoon, while returning from the market, she ran into an old acquaintance, one of the tailors she used to know from Benin before she moved to Abuja. His name was Keen, a soft-spoken man with a smile that held no expectations. They talked briefly, catching up on lost years, and before leaving, he invited her to collaborate on a small clothing project he was organizing in town. Doris hesitated at first, wary of anything that sounded like the beginning of something new, but there was kindness in his eyes, a sincerity that disarmed her. The next week, she attended his workshop, surrounded by laughter, fabric, and music. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. Keen admired her skill, and soon their friendship grew into something easy and steady. Nothing like the whirlwind she once mistook for love. They shared stories, helped each other with orders, and in quiet moments, she found herself smiling without the shadow of guilt. Her mother noticed the change and said, "See your face. This one no be love way burn, this one na love way warm." Doris laughed, shaking her head, but deep down, she knew her mother was right. Keen never rushed her, never asked about her past, and that, more than anything, made her heart open slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. She wasn't sure if it was love yet, but it was peace, and peace, she had learned, was worth more than passion. By the time another rainy season arrived, Doris had begun to dream again. The shop she and Keen opened together thrived. Their designs caught attention beyond Benin, and customers came from as far as Asaba and Wari. Each day brought a new reminder that healing didn't come all at once. It arrived in moments, in small victories, in laughter that returned quietly after years of silence. Sometimes, when the sky turned gray and thunder rolled in the distance, Doris stood by the doorway watching the rain pour down, her thoughts drifting to everything she had survived. She no longer wished things had been different. Every scar had its own story, and hers was one of endurance and rebirth. One evening, after closing the shop, Keen walked her home. The air was cool, and the smell of wet earth filled the street. "You've changed," he said softly. "No," she replied with a faint smile. "I just remembered who I was before life scattered me." When she reached her gate, she turned to him and added, "Thank you for reminding me that peace can wear a gentle face." He smiled but said nothing. Later that night, Doris sat outside beneath the mango tree, where she had once cried herself to sleep. The stars were clear, the world was still, and for the first time in years, her heart beat without fear. Somewhere deep within, she whispered, the fire went cold, but it lit a new path. And as the night breeze brushed against her skin, she closed her eyes, no longer haunted by yesterday, but quietly grateful for the woman she had finally become. My dear listeners, life has a way of testing the strength of our hearts. Sometimes, what feels like love can be the very thing that breaks us. But never forget, no pain lasts forever. When life scatters you, Gather yourself again with grace. Don't chase what was never meant to stay. Real love will never make you lose your peace. Be patient with yourself, because healing is not forgetting. It's learning to breathe again without the ache. Hold your dignity close, even when the world tries to shame your story. Remember, the fire that tried to burn you can also be the light that shows you the way forward. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of second chances. For everyone listening tonight who has loved and lost, who has cried behind closed doors, and who feels forgotten, Lord, touch their hearts with peace. Heal every wound that words cannot reach. Restore confidence where it has been broken, and replace regret with wisdom. May every listener find a love that is pure, calm, and true. May they never again settle for pain disguised as affection. Let joy visit their homes, let laughter return to their voices, and let strength rise again in their spirits. Father, turn every heartbreak into a stepping stone for greater things ahead. May peace never depart from their hearts. In Jesus' name we pray, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.